7:30 in the evening. April 10th, 1992. A stretch of Highway 95 cutting through the California desert, 3 miles north of Needles, right where the Mojave meets the Nevada border. The sun is dropping fast, painting everything orange and red, and Sam Kinison is lying on the side of the road with his best friend Derek holding his bleeding head in both hands. There are only minor cuts on Sam's lips and forehead. He looks fine. He looks like a man who just walked away from a car accident, maybe a little shaken, maybe needing a few stitches, but alive. His white 1989 Pontiac Trans Am is crumpled behind him, the windshield shattered from the inside where his skull went through it because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. His wife Jade, married to him for exactly 6 days, is unconscious in the passenger seat, and Sam is talking. But not to Derek, not to his brother Blake who just ran over from the van. Sam Kinison, the loudest comedian in America, the man who made a career out of screaming at God, is having a quiet conversation with someone no one else can see. "I don't want to die," he says. "I don't want to die." Then he stops. He listens. His eyes are fixed on something in the empty sky. "But why?" he asks. Another pause. Longer this time. Derek would later describe it like watching a man on the phone, waiting for the other person to finish talking. Then Sam's voice drops to almost a whisper, softer than anyone had ever heard him speak, and he says 3 words. "Okay, okay, okay." The last one comes out like a sigh, like acceptance, like peace. And then Sam Kinison closes his eyes and stops breathing. The ambulance won't arrive for another 12 minutes. By then, it won't matter. Now, if you don't know who Sam Kinison was, you need to understand something. This wasn't just a comedian dying on a desert highway. This was the most dangerous voice in American comedy going silent at the peak of his power. Sam Kinison started as a Pentecostal preacher in Illinois, screaming about hellfire and damnation to half-empty churches. Then he figured out the same voice worked better for making people laugh than making them pray. By 1985, he was performing on HBO with Rodney Dangerfield, and Dangerfield introduced him by saying, "Brace yourselves, I'm not kidding." By 1988, his cover of Wild Thing got him nominated for a Grammy. He influenced Bill Hicks. He influenced Jim Carrey. Joe Rogan still calls him one of the greatest to ever do it. His license plate read ex-rev, ex-reverend, the preacher who quit God to tell the truth instead. And here's what makes this story impossible to forget. Sam Kinison spent years destroying himself with cocaine and alcohol. He crashed cars. He ruined marriages. He picked fights with everyone from Slash to Bobcat Goldthwait. He was the definition of self-destruction. But by April of '92, he was clean. Almost a year sober. He had just married the woman he loved. He was driving to a sold-out show. 2 movie deals were waiting to be signed that Tuesday, one with Arnold Schwarzenegger, one with Rick Moranis. Sam Kinison died doing everything right. And he died because a 17-year-old kid with a truck full of beer cans decided to pass on a 2-lane highway. That's not tragedy. That's something else. Something that still doesn't have a name. To understand how Sam Kinison ended up on that highway, talking to something invisible while his life drained out of him, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to Yakima, Washington, 1953. Where Samuel Burl Kinison was born into a family that lived on faith and not much else. His father was a Pentecostal preacher who moved the family from church to church across the country, never staying long, never earning enough. By the time Sam was 3 months old, they had settled in East Peoria, Illinois, a small town where religion was the only entertainment and poverty was just another test from God. Sam had 2 older brothers, Richard and Blake, and a younger brother named Kevin. They grew up watching their father scream about hellfire from wooden pulpits, learning that volume was power and conviction was everything. But there's a detail about Sam's childhood that most people don't know. A detail that feels almost too symbolic to be true. When Sam was 3 years old, he was hit by a truck. The accident caused brain damage, minor but permanent, and some who knew him later would say it explained his intensity, his lack of filter, his inability to hold anything back. A truck nearly killed him at 3. A truck would finish the job at 38. Some patterns don't need interpretation. When Sam was 11, his parents divorced, and the family split apart in a way that would define everything that came after. Blake went to live with their father. Sam stayed with his mother against his wishes, begging to go with his brother instead. Blake would later say that this was the root of all Sam's anger, the wound that never healed, the rejection that turned into fuel. Sam's mother remarried another preacher and moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, dragging Sam along. By 17, Sam was preaching his own sermons, using the same fire and brimstone style his father had taught him, screaming about sin and salvation to congregations that didn't know what to make of him. He preached until he was 24. He got married to a woman named Patricia, and when that marriage fell apart, something inside Sam fell apart with it. He looked at the pulpit, looked at the empty pews, looked at the life he was living, and he walked away. Not from God exactly, but from the version of God that had failed him. The comedy stage found Sam the same way the pulpit had, through pure volume and absolute commitment. He moved to Houston first, performing in small clubs, joining a group called the Texas Outlaw Comics, alongside a young comedian named Bill Hicks, who would later call Sam the first performer he ever saw who didn't ask the audience to like him. In 1980, Sam moved to Los Angeles, hoping to get work at the Comedy Store, and instead got hired as a doorman. He developed a cocaine addiction, then an alcohol addiction. Then he started freebasing, and his career stalled while his demons multiplied. It wasn't until Blake moved to Los Angeles to manage him that things started to change. In August of 1985, Sam got his break on HBO's Rodney Dangerfield's Young Comedians special. The New York Times called him savagely funny and described his signature scream as the primal scream of the married man. By 1988, his cover of Wild Thing was nominated for a Grammy. He appeared in Back to School with Dangerfield. He hosted Saturday Night Live. He became the loudest voice in America. And then, just when it seemed like nothing could stop him, he fell in love for the 3rd time and decided to become someone new. Her name was Jade. She was 26 years old, a dancer from Las Vegas with dark hair and a smile that made Sam forget every woman who had ever left him. They met while Sam was still married to his second wife, Terry, and their relationship became one more scandal in a career built on scandals. But by 1992, the scandals were over. Sam was sober, Terry was gone. And on April 4th, 72 hours before the end, Sam Kinison stood at the altar of the Candlelight Chapel in Las Vegas and cried like a child while he married the woman he believed would save him. His publicist Heather was there, watching from the second row. She would later tell reporters, "I saw Sam with tears pouring down his face. He was very, very happy. It was the most wonderful time of his life." Blake was there too, standing beside his brother as best man, watching the same wild man who had once choked Slash from Guns N' Roses in a hotel lobby now promising to love and cherish until death do them part. Sam was superstitious about many things. He believed that writing a will was inviting trouble, tempting fate, calling death to your door. But marriage was different. Marriage was a fresh start. Marriage meant the darkness was finally behind him. The honeymoon lasted 5 days. Sam and Jade flew to Hawaii, and for nearly a week, the loudest comedian in America was quiet. He didn't perform. He didn't scream. He walked on beaches with his new wife and talked about the future, about the 2 movie deals waiting back in Los Angeles, about the children they might have, about the life he was finally ready to live. Friends who spoke to him during those days said he sounded different, lighter, like a man who had put down a weight he'd been carrying for decades. He had been clean for almost a year. No cocaine, no alcohol, no self-destruction. When they boarded the plane back to Los Angeles on the morning of April 10th, Sam Kinison was not the same man who had stumbled through the 80s in a haze of drugs and failed marriages. He was something new, something hopeful, something that made his death just hours later feel less like tragedy and more like cosmic cruelty. They landed in Los Angeles that Friday morning, and this is where the story takes its first strange turn. Sam was supposed to fly directly to Laughlin, Nevada, where a sold-out show was waiting for him at the Riverside Casino. Flying would have been faster, safer, and made more sense. But Blake had rented a van to drive the equipment, and Sam decided at the last minute to follow in his Trans Am with Jade beside him. They left Los Angeles in the afternoon, heading east on Interstate 40 before turning north on Highway 95. And then, about 20 minutes before the accident, Sam did something that no one has ever been able to explain. He pulled over and asked Blake to stop the van. He got out of the Trans Am, opened the trunk, and transferred everything he owned into Blake's vehicle. His bags, his clothes, his things. And then he put Russo, his untrained dog, into the van with Blake and Nathan, the assistant, and Derek, his best friend. Blake asked him why. Sam didn't answer. He just got back into his car with Jade and drove away, ahead of the van, into the fading desert light. 20 minutes later, on a straight stretch of highway with clear visibility in both directions, a Chevrolet pickup truck appeared in the oncoming lane. Behind the wheel was Troy, a 17-year-old high school football player with beer cans scattered across the floor of the cab. His friend Cody sat beside him in the passenger seat. Troy was trying to pass another vehicle, crossing the center line into oncoming traffic, and there was a second truck behind him, blocking his view of what was coming. Sam saw the pickup heading toward him. He slowed his Trans Am down to 15 miles per hour, trying to give Troy room to get back into his lane. But Troy didn't see Sam, and by the time he did, there was no room left for anyone. The impact happened at 7:30 in the evening, just as the desert sun was turning the sky into fire. The Chevrolet pickup crossed the center line at approximately 60 miles per hour, and Sam's Trans Am, already slowed to a crawl, took the full force of the collision head-on. The physics of what happened next are simple and brutal. Sam wasn't wearing his seatbelt, a habit he had never broken despite everything else he had changed about himself. When the two vehicles met, his body kept moving forward at the speed the car had been traveling, and his head went through the windshield like a fist through paper. Jade, unconscious in the passenger seat, was thrown forward against the dashboard. The Trans Am crumpled around them both, folding in on itself like aluminum foil, and when it finally stopped moving, Sam Kinison was pinned between the seats with his skull split open, and his neck twisted at an angle that shouldn't have allowed him to breathe, let alone speak. But he was breathing, and he would speak. For a few more minutes, Sam Kinison would do both. Blake saw it happen. He was driving the van maybe 200 yards behind, close enough to watch the pickup swerve into his brother's lane, close enough to see the flash of metal meeting metal, close enough to hear the sound that would follow him for the rest of his life. He slammed the brakes and ran toward the wreckage with Derek and Nathan right behind him. When they reached the Trans Am, they expected to find a body. Instead, they found Sam pulling himself out of the driver's side door, standing on his own 2 feet, touching his face where the blood was dripping from a cut on his lip. He looked confused but conscious. He looked like a man who had just survived something unsurvivable. Blake begged him to lie down. Derek begged him to stay still. Sam refused at first, walking in small circles beside the ruined car, looking up at the sky like he was waiting for something. And then, finally, he sat down on the side of the road and let Derek cradle his head in his hands. The autopsy would later reveal what none of them could see in that moment. Sam Kinison's neck was dislocated. His aorta was torn. Blood vessels in his abdominal cavity had ruptured and were filling his body with blood that had nowhere to go. These were injuries that killed in minutes, not hours. Injuries so catastrophic that the fact Sam was conscious at all defied medical explanation. But he was conscious, and he was talking. Not to Derek, not to Blake, to someone else. "I don't want to die," he said, his voice clear despite everything, his eyes fixed on a point in the empty air. "I don't want to die." Then silence. A pause that Derek would later describe as listening, like a man on the phone waiting for a response. Then Sam asked, "But why?" Another pause. Longer. And then 3 times, each softer than the last, "Okay, okay, okay." The final word came out like a whisper, like surrender, like peace. Blake would say years later that in that moment, he noticed Russo, the dog in the van, standing with his paws on the dashboard, staring at Sam's body as if he could see something hovering there that no human could perceive. And then Sam closed his eyes, and the man who had spent his life screaming at the world finally went quiet. A passerby named Marcus stopped and tried to perform CPR. It didn't work. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later and pronounced Sam Kinison dead on arrival at Needles Desert Community Hospital. He was 38 years old. He had been married for 6 days. He had been sober for almost a year. And the teenager who killed him would spend exactly 2 days in jail before posting bail. Troy was charged with vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence. He pleaded guilty, and the sentence he received became the second tragedy of this story. 1 year of probation, 300 hours of community service, 2 years with his driver's license suspended. That was the price for killing Sam Kinison. That was the cost of driving drunk on a Friday night with beer cans rolling around the floor of your truck while you tried to pass on a 2-lane highway. Witnesses at the scene reported that moments after the crash, while Sam was still breathing his last breaths on the side of the road, Troy climbed out of his wrecked pickup, looked at the damage and said, "God, look at my truck." Not, "Is everyone okay?" Not, "What have I done?" Just concern for his vehicle while a man lay dying 20 feet away. Years later, posts would appear on internet forums claiming that Troy sold autographs and bragged about the accident at parties, though these claims were never officially confirmed. What is confirmed is that the man who killed one of America's greatest comedians never spent a single night in prison. And the question that haunted Sam's fans, his family, and everyone who followed the case was simple. Is 1 year of probation justice for a life? Is 300 hours of community service enough to pay for erasing a genius from the world? Jade woke up in Needles Desert Community Hospital with a concussion and no memory of the impact. When they told her that Sam was dead, that he had been gone before the ambulance even arrived, she collapsed. She had been his wife for 6 days. 6 days of marriage after years of chaos, years of waiting for him to get clean, years of believing that the best was still ahead. And now she was a widow at 26, alone in a hospital room in a town she had never heard of, trying to understand how a honeymoon in Hawaii had ended on a highway in the desert. But the tragedy of Sam Kinison's death was only the beginning. The shadows that followed would stretch for decades. When Jade was released from the hospital, Blake was waiting with news. Sam had left a will, he said. A will that named Blake as the primary beneficiary of the estate, giving him control of Sam's image, his recordings, his legacy, and most of the money. Jade was stunned. She knew Sam. She knew he was superstitious, that he believed writing a will was inviting death, tempting fate, calling the reaper to your door. Sam would never have signed such a document. But Blake had the paperwork, and Jade was grieving, and 17 years would pass before she found the strength to fight back. In 2009, Jade filed a lawsuit in Los Angeles Superior Court, claiming that Blake had forged the will, that he had drafted it himself and signed Sam's name after his brother was already dead. A friend of Sam's, she claimed, had confessed to being part of the forgery in 2007. The lawsuit accused Blake of exploiting Sam's voice and image for nearly 2 decades, while his widow received almost nothing. The case would drag on for years, and the question it raised would never fully be answered. Who really inherited Sam Kinison? And what would Sam have wanted if he had lived long enough to decide for himself? But the cruelest revelation was still waiting for Derek, the best friend who had held Sam's bleeding head in his hands while he died. The opening act who had toured with Sam for years, who had stood beside him through addiction and recovery, who had watched him find love and lose his life in the span of a single week. In 2011, 19 years after the accident, DNA tests would confirm what Derek had never suspected. The daughter he had raised for 13 years, the child he had paid support for, the girl he believed was his own flesh and blood, was not his daughter at all. She was Sam's. Sam Kinison had fathered a child with Derek's wife, and Derek had never known. The man who held Sam while he spoke his last words to an invisible presence had been holding the man who betrayed him. Sam Kinison was buried at Memorial Park Cemetery in Tulsa, Oklahoma, beside his family. His gravestone bears an inscription that reads, "In another time and place, he would have been called Prophet." George Carlin dedicated his 1993 HBO special to Sam, with 3 words on the screen before the show began. "This show is for Sam." The boy who was hit by a truck at 3 years old was killed by another truck at 38. The preacher who abandoned God spent his final seconds talking to something no one else could see. The addict who finally got sober died because someone else was drunk. And the question remains, hanging in the desert air, like heat shimmer on a highway. Who was Sam Kinison talking to when he said, "Okay, okay, okay"? What did he see that made him stop fighting? What was offered to him that turned fear into peace? Blake believes that Sam was given a choice in that moment, and that if he had been allowed to come back, he would have chosen not to. Maybe that's true. Maybe Sam found something better waiting on the other side of that conversation. Or maybe dying men see things that the living will never understand. Either way, Sam Kinison left this world the same way he lived in it, screaming at first, then quiet, then gone.